Now, welcome to the next session of NeedToKnow British Cultural Studies, where we are going to cover a lot of ground because we start out with performativity, then go over to queer studies, and even touch upon intersectionality. Now, gender performativity relates to gender as a performance, but before we delve into that topic, let's have a look at the background. First, discourse. If you remember, Michel Foucault, a French philosopher and sociologist, coined that concept and described it as bodies of knowledge that systematically form the objects of which they speak. So, important takeaways from here: every knowledge that we have in the world is delivered and mediated and worked upon in the form of a discourse, which is at one hand saying what is true about the topic, also limits what can be said because there are certain things that are not true, and it is related to language. So basically how we speak of things, what we can say, what we can't say, then forms the objects in our imagination. So basically what we think about something when it comes to language shapes how we perceive the world. Next topic is habitus. This is also a French concept by Pierre Bourdieu, and it relates to embodified class unconsciousness. So Bourdieu says that the taste of a person, the activities one engages in, and also the forms of capital, if you remember, cultural capital, economic capital, and social capital that a person has, are linked to their upbringing, linked to their background, linked to the class the people come from. So basically, how a person behaves in society is based on their upbringing, and this really unconsciously shapes how a person sees themselves and also how other people see this person. So habitus is not only something about words and discourse, but rather also something about the body. And this is the third important point when we look at the background of gender as performance. The body here is the central means of gender representation. So in a discourse, we say that words or language is the main means of representation, and in gender as a performance, it is the body. Because the biological basis is in a way changeable. Not as in, okay, I can just, without doing anything, change everything about my material body, but rather that by working on this body, I can change it. So the physical and mental activities that people do, they develop the body in a certain way. If you use your muscles, they will grow. If you all the time are told to make yourself small or make yourself big, we had this discussion about men spreading, for example, then your body will develop in a certain way and you will just, without even noticing, so unconscious, develop this like gender unconsciousness. So basically how you behave in society changes your body. We also had the notion of neuroplasticity, but I won't go into detail about that because that will take ages. But if you're interested in that, have a look at the first video about gender. Now, gender performativity is a concept coined by Judith Butler, and the key idea is that a gender is a repeated performance that becomes second nature and constitutes rather than merely represents a norm. So basically that when people are representing their gender, they're using their body and over again perform a certain role, but not like in the theater where you just go on stage and then, well, you play a role and then you just get off stage again and then you are yourself again, but rather like the world's a stage. So there is no off stage here because you're constantly on performance. And this also means that you never get to step out of this role and it becomes second nature. So people behave in a certain way in a certain context, and this performance, not like a theater performance that you can just stop at some point when you go off stage, is just what you constantly do. It is what becomes your identity. And it also constitutes rather than merely represents the norms. This means that the body is stylized, so stylized also in the sense of we style the body, so hair, makeup, dressing it, also tattoos, for example, would be something that is stylization of the body, but also just how do I use my body, how do I behave, how do I move it in space. So this body or the body is stylized according to a regulatory framework, gender norms, gender roles, scripts. And this over time appears like a substance. So basically, because we constantly repeat performances, we establish and reify those norms. And the basis and at the same time the product of those gendered performance are these ideal scripts. So by performing scripts and norms over and over again, we reconstitute and stabilize these norms. The ideal is, of course, unattainable, but this provides the idea of appropriateness and an aim where this performance has to go. So the role models we have in movies, on the screens of the world, but also in everyday life, those role models are what we are aiming our performance at. And this is what we think of, okay, this is what femininity, masculinity, or any other gender has to be like. Now let's have a look at an example. This statistics is the result of a survey that was conducted with 180 students, and it gives you the top 7 male and female characteristics. Well, if you use our terminology, it would be the top 7 masculine and feminine characteristics because it's related to gender, not related to sex as a category. Now, my question for you is, can you link the concept of performativity to this image? Maybe pause the video for a second and think about it. What I can say here is that all attributes that you see there are related to performance of some kind. None of this is a stable condition. None of this is something that something just has or doesn't have. It's something about how do people behave in society. And we can also see color coding. So certain colors are used to represent certain genders. And also about visual performance. So the body as a site of representation when we look at the dolls which we have up there representing masculinity and femininity. And I think what is also important here is that they asked students. So this is not about we ask every person in society what they think, but rather we ask students who are still in their education, so young people. And we can see that those gender stereotypes are extremely ingrained in the population from a very young age onwards. Now, one reason for even school children distinguishing between masculinity and femininity in that way is heteronormativity, a keyword of today's session. It combines heterosexuality and the norm. Judith Butler writes, quote, "There is no reason to divide up human bodies into male and female sexes, except that such a division suits the economic needs of heterosexuality and lends a naturalistic gloss to the institution of heterosexuality," unquote. So, as we discussed in the previous session, there is no empirical or biological basis to have this binary distinction into human bodies into male and female sex. It is more or less something that has been established over time, and this division, however, suits the economic needs of heterosexuality. So we do have the established heterosexuality as a norm, heteronormativity, and so of course, if you have this system in place, you try to reinforce this system because everything in the society is based on this system, the system of reproduction, this system of representation, for example. And here I want to quote another scholar, which is Sarah Ahmed, and she writes that there is the ideal of the family and compulsory heterosexuality. Now maybe think about movies, think about advertisement, think about whatever representations of sexuality you are represented with in society or you're presented with in society. And a lot of them, actually most of them, feature heterosexuality. So heterosexuality is really the norm, and it exceeds mere heterosexual relationships because you do have the representations, but this comes along with legitimacy and also the naturalization. So heterosexuality is seen as normal, as natural, and everything else is seen as, well, different. And we also can relate that to infra-penalty. Sometimes even the law enforces hetero lives. I mean, this comes to a halt, but if you think about what happens in, for example, the United States nowadays, and also in other parts of the world where conservative governments are in place again, there we do have quite a big backlash against any form of sexuality and any lives that do not conform to heteronormativity. Now, heteronormativity can be seen as a framework that keeps heterosexuality in place, that stabilizes it, and that also defends it in a way. Now, you could ask yourself, okay, why the heck do we have to defend heterosexuality? And this is because of the so-called precariousness of the category. Precariousness relates to the instability and ever-changing quality of existence and meanings when it comes to humans, to the vulnerability of the existence of, for example, identity categories. Now, this is because humans or human identities depend on recognition. So, if a certain person wants to feel as I am me in a certain way and my representation of my identity is accepted, then it is needed to be accepted or recognized by others. So, in order to feel myself as me. Others have to accept me in the same way that I see myself. And if they don't, I will start to change something about me, or my self-perception will change because I'm not recognized by others. And I found a quote from Bernard Shaw's Pygmalion, which is one of the best known theatre plays in British culture. And if you know the musical My Fair Lady, you basically know the story. It's about the flower girl who is coming from a working class background. Think Bourdieu here, so her habitus is really, really working class, and she also speaks in Cockney dialect. And now this flower girl, Eliza, comes into the custody of two gentlemen, Professor Higgins and Colonel Pickering. And now the thing is that, well, Professor Higgins really doesn't have any manners and treats basically everybody like shit. Colonel Pickering does have manners and treats everybody very politely. And now, towards the end of the play, Eliza states the following, quote, "The difference between a lady and a flower girl is not how she behaves, but how she's treated. I shall always be a flower girl to Professor Higgins because he always treats me as a flower girl and always will. But I know I can be a lady to you because you always treat me as a lady and always will." Unquote. So basically, Eliza states that she feels different, not because she behaves in a certain way and she performs her new identity as a lady in a certain way, but rather because she is also treated as a lady, because people give her that respect, because people recognize her. But this also means that her identity is extremely vulnerable to how is she treated. And this applies to everything. This applies to every kind of identity, and especially to gender identities. So we can say that since these categories are all precarious, they can change according to what is recognized as such, and they are extendable but also limited. So we can say that, okay, because of this precariousness, we can actually widen femininity and masculinity. We can include queer categories. But we can also say that, okay, all those categories are vulnerable and we need to defend them. And this then feeds into the idea of conservative politics. This feeds into the idea of, okay, there's something at stake here, and this is our norm, and we have to defend our norm. And this then excludes others, marginalizes other experiences. And this is then where queer studies comes into play. Queer studies, yeah, well, it includes the term queer, and let's have a look at what queer means. Queer's original meaning is a derogatory term for LGBTQ plus individuals, so it was an insult. But then, in the AIDS pandemic, the word queer was reclaimed as a self-definition, a basis for solidarity by this very community. And since the 1990s, it has become an umbrella term for non-heteronormative identities that share the experience of marginalization because of their gender and sexual identity. Now, queer studies is part of cultural studies, for example, and it explores the relationship between sex, gender, and sexuality. And also it questions the foundations of heteronormativity. So why is it in place? And is it actually maybe not an unfair framework? We can say it is theory as a form of activism. And yeah, well, if you think back to our very first sessions, then this might remind you of the political aim of cultural studies. So that cultural studies as a theory or a theoretical strand or academic discipline says, okay, there's something at stake in culture. There is something at stake because we want to not only look at the world and analyze it, but we also want to criticize and, if possible, change something in the world by studying it and by giving new perspectives. So this would then be queer studies and queer theory. Now, linguistically speaking, queer is an adjective, but there are some scholars who claim that queer should rather be seen as a verb because it relates to queering as a practice. In relation to that, Sarah Ahmed writes of queer lives. Now, queering. If you think of gender performativity, we had this idea of established frameworks or norms which are repeated, and by repeating them and repeating the performance associated with them, they are reified, so basically the norm is strengthened, or they can be reconstituted differently. And we could even go so far as to say that a copy is never the same as the original. So whenever someone repeats a gender performance and goes according to a script, goes according to some expectations, this copy or this performance will never be the same as the original ideal. And in gender, we can even say that there is no fixed original, because gender roles and gender expectations constantly change according to what is the hegemonic discourse at a certain point in time. So what kind of performance is expected from people, and this changes. Think back to older Hollywood movies and you will see completely different gender scripts, maybe not 100% different, but very different still from what we have today. So gender performances and expectations change. So there is this subversive potential in the very performance of gender. And queering now would be the active transgression of boundaries of gender identity. We, on the last slide, discussed what queer means, and here we have queering as all the people who, based on their gender identity and sexuality, do not fit the picture of binary identities. All the people who actively transgress the boundaries are queering those boundaries. And now we do have queer lives as concept by Sarah Ahmed, and she says that those are the spaces defined by heteronormativity that are inhabited by queer individuals. Now, think back to heteronormativity, and we can basically say that all the spaces, all the roles, all the scripts in society are influenced, or most of them are influenced by heteronormativity. What roles do you have in a family, in a relationship, at school, in society, in jobs? What names are there for job? There is actor and there is actress, binary distinction. There is mother and there is father role, binary distinction, and it continues like that. So this binary is something institutionalized, something normative, something hegemonic. But we do have individuals, as we discussed just about a second ago, individuals who don't conform to these roles, and still they inhabit those spaces which are defined by heteronormativity. And this also means that there's always a gap between the script or the role and the body. So the person who inhabits this role doesn't really completely fulfill what heteronormativity dictates. There's a failure to fully inhabit the script. And this is, according to Sarah Ahmed, not really a bad thing, but actually a potential. She says, quote, "To turn this around, queer lives shape what gets reproduced. In the very failure to reproduce the norms through how they inhabit them, queer lives produce different effects," unquote. She also speaks of generative discomfort. So basically, a queer person, because this person does not fit into the norms of gender binary, cannot fully inhabit these spaces defined by heteronormativity. So there is discomfort with these spaces. Something doesn't fit. And this discomfort is, however, not seen as something that marginalizes the experience here, but if enough people do that, if enough people orientate themselves towards this difference, then it can be generative. It can generate new norms, new rules, and basically by performing norms differently, change those norms into a queer direction. It is time for another example. Please have a look at this poster under the perspective of how do heteronormativity and gender norms interact with queer identities. Maybe pause the video for a second. And now let's continue. I want to make some key points here. Representation matters. So basically, ask yourself who is represented? How are they represented? And what is maybe not represented when you watch a movie or when you see advertisement in society? Then the question of inhabiting space and comfort and discomfort. So what spaces do we have in society? Who inhabits them and how are they inhabited? And where does comfort and discomfort maybe come into tension? Where does discomfort maybe create generative potential to change the norms? Then orientation. Now imagine orientation as what are my goals? What are the ideals I orientate myself towards? And imagine that people are basically in society walking on a field of fresh snow. And if everybody orientates towards the same aim, towards the same ideal, then of course you do basically have a motorway in the snow because everybody walks the same path. But if people orientate towards different goals, towards different ideals, then you will have different paths. Maybe small paths at first because some people are deviating from the norm. But if a critical mass of people goes different ways, then the perspectives broaden and you do have broad possibilities. And this is what queer studies tries to achieve. A diversification of orientation so that people, even though they might have different perspectives, can live in society and live together and don't really all have to follow the same norms. But there are, of course, also debates in queer studies, and this is the final note on queer studies I want to have with you here. One is gay marriage. So the question of, is gay marriage a possibility for representation, or B, maybe actually a strategy of heteronormativity to press people who are queer, who are different, into the framework of heteronormativity? I don't want to give an answer here because there is no simple answer, but those are debates going on. And then also another important debate is about normalization, norms of being queer, and idealization. So yes, we do have those gender ideals with relation to masculinity and femininity, and they're performative and they change. But we do also have developing norms about queerness. So people are asking themselves, okay, am I queer enough to be counted as queer? Am I queer enough, or am I enough to fit into this or that category? And also ideals about what does it mean to be gay or lesbian? What does it mean to be a queer person? And then norms developing about that, which is very much under contestation because in a way, queer is basically about not fitting the norm. And if we have norms developing, that is a challenge. Now, I want to introduce a final concept, which is intersectionality. And if you have had a close look at the poster in the previous slide, then you will have noticed that word. And it is a concept that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. And you can see her picture just above me. And as you might see, she's A, a person of color, and B, a woman. And this is basically quite a good interaction to what intersectionality is about. It is about how different identity variables intersect to create unique patterns of marginalization and privilege. So basically, a person of color is not only racialized, but may well be experiencing sexism, or experiencing class-based discrimination, or experience any other kind of discrimination based upon age, upbringing, forms of capital, or infra-penalty systems. And now I don't want to waste too many words on which variable can intersect with which one, because that would take me ages. I'm going to give you this picture here, which I think summarizes very well some different variables and how they intersect, and also how they create unique patterns of privilege and discrimination. And now let's come to the final application example for today's session, which is the 2020 Netflix series Hollywood. Yes, I know, this is not a British example, it's an American example, but I think it's a very good example. And on the other hand, we could always say that American film industry is globally influential. Whatever, let's have a look. So this series is called a rewrite of the 1940s Hollywood scene, and it is kind of a what if. A what if concerning gender hierarchies, racism, and the representation of people who are facing intersectional discrimination. At the same time, it is full of stereotypes. And now we could argue two ways. Either this is a strategy, it uses stereotypes to convey things better. On the other hand, we can say, okay, well, stereotypes are just a very typical means of films, and you can't really get out of this. It's just using stereotypes because that's hegemonic. Whatever, that's for you to discuss. My question would be, can you apply the content of this or other sessions to the trailer of the Netflix series? I'll give you the link in the description as well, because you can't click on it here. But have a look at this series and yes, discuss this under the light of today's session. And now, on that note, I want to end this session and say thank you very much for bearing with me, and see you next time.